Thank you very much, Carles. Beautiful pictures, anatomy pictures. I like that very much. Now I introduce the next speaker, Seth O Neill. Seth O Neill is a colleague from the physiotherapy at University of Leicester in UK. And he will talk about the Soleus. Seth, welcome in Switzerland.
Cool, thank you very much. Lovely to be here. And it's very hard to follow Carlos when he's been talking about calf injuries, particularly when he's got such beautiful slides and imaging of anatomy that's really quite useful and informative when we're talking about management. And Carlos will get quite a few mentions in this Soleus talk as well. So we know that calf injuries are a big problem in elite sports. We know they cause repeated problems with re-injuries occurring. And that's been sort of substantiated for a long time. So in a Premiership football club, let's say, you'll have 2.5 calf injuries per squad per season is typically normal. But then what you'll find is some squads will actually see a lot more of these. There's one squad we worked with a few years back that had 11 calf injuries prior to December. So they'd only started the season in August and had 11 injuries, which starts to raise concerns about training loads or preparedness, the robustness of the players that you've got. In rugby, there's a lot of injury surveillance data that exists as well, and calf injuries are normally within that top 2. So hamstrings are right up there and calf's the next one down. It'll occasionally flip around depending on what year's happened and whether we've got projects that are running, which increases the reporting rate of any given injury. So we always have to be aware of that. We also know from the UEFA data that exists that calf injuries particularly have an association with age. This is quite important because you can see on this graph that hamstrings, quads, groin do not relate to age. So the great age ranges are at the bottom, 16 to 21, 22 to 30, and over 30. And those players that get injured in that older age group are typically your captains, your senior players, your critical players for a squad and the performance, whether you're talking about a normal team or a national setup. These players make a difference out on field, and trying to keep them playing is really critical. But over the years, we've not had much understanding about what leads to calf injuries, and in particularly around the soleus. So we undertook some work with the English FA and used the surveillance data that they have obtained to look at what happens for calf injuries. So this is still calf, not specifically soleus at the minute. And you can see when the injuries happen during the season. No surprise, it's during the pre-season training when everybody's had a rest and returns to play. But also what you'll observe in the graphs on the right-hand side is when the injuries occur in relation to a game. So the soleus tends to get injured towards the second part of the first half or towards the end of the game, suggesting that there might be an element of fatigue that's relevant for this injury. Whereas the gastroc injuries seem to occur more frequently at the start of the game or at the start of the second half, suggesting this could be a neuromuscular miscoordination, a bit like ACL injuries. So it gives us something to go on. We've got some nice data from Brady Green over in Australia that's done quite an extensive work around this in AFL, so the Aussie rules football, not to be confused with proper football. But what they've identified is the mechanism of injury, which is quite informative because we need to understand the mechanism when we're talking about rehabilitation and returning players to play on field, because we've got to ensure that they can actually go through correct rehab that gets them back to the causative factor. Whether that was a step back, whether that was high-speed running, they're all essential elements that we might want to look at. And it seems when we look in the bottom graphs that the gastroc injuries in the white bar seem to occur slightly more frequently in high-intensity running than the soleus injuries occur, suggesting again it might be about explosive loads, which again might indicate how we want to go about rehabilitation. Now, in the English FA's data, one of the big questions we had is which of the two muscles, gastroc or soleus, is most frequently injured. Brady had found in the AFL data that around 85%, 83% of injuries were soleus. But often when we train in medical schools and physio schools around the world, we learn that actually the gastroc's the main muscle. It's really important, gets injured the most, and is the main locomotive muscle. The data doesn't support that. We found in our data set, this is 328 calf injuries sustained during those seasons that were looked at across the English FA's data, that 251 of them, 75%, was the soleus. So it's really important that we understand the differentiation between these muscles, because when we want to do rehabilitation and loading, we need to consider what the muscles do and their role in function. So hopefully it's going to tie up that function with the structure. And we've seen some of Carlos's beautiful scans and images showing the different elements around the soleus. Soleus is a really complex muscle. It has 3 intramuscular tendons, a lateral, a medial, and a central one. And often the injuries, as we've just been hearing from Carlos, are sustained around those particular zones. Carlos has published some work that's shown that injuries around some of these zones may rehabilitate quicker or longer than before. And obviously there's a debate, as we heard with Rod earlier, but there does seem to be a bit of a trend here, and we need further data to substantiate this. I think we've still got the big calf project has restarted, Rod, which we need to mention. And so if you've got squads that are interested, we're going to try and pool data to look at recovery over a period of time. Just drop me an email and we'll share information about it. It's a good call, I think, that one. We'll pick it up in the questions later. Now, soleus, we learn, is a postural muscle, and my students at university still get taught that it keeps us upright, and that's really its main role. It's not its main role. It is hugely strong. So as an anatomical cross-sectional area in the top bit, the soleus makes up the majority of the actual calf cross-section, but it's obviously much smaller than my quads, my hamstrings, or my glutes. But its physical area, because of the amount of fibers and the angulation of those, is much bigger than any other lower limb muscle. That allows it to produce forces that are around 8 times body weight for any single speed of running that you look at. So 3 meters per second, right the way up to flat out sprinting at 9 meters per second. This is hugely important we understand that for rehab, because if we do a slow run, it's still high soleus forces. It's not less. And a typical rehabilitation phase would be, we'll go for a slow jog, and then we'll build up the speed. Well, actually, that's still a high demand. And many of you will have experienced this in rehab, where that's still broken your player again. They've relapsed or felt tweaks within their muscle. Equally then, the soleus and the gastroc have a complex orientation with the Achilles tendon. They have individual fascicles called subtendons that run into the Achilles. And actually, we tend to see a lot of the injuries in the Achilles tendon around areas that are probably relevant to the soleus. It's a debate, but one we can have later. The soleus itself will produce at least 50% of your total vertical force getting you off the floor, okay? Really critical. It's actually around about 70%. And the 2 graphs, they show you vertical force in the bottom graph, and in the top graph, horizontal force. And you can see soleus exceeds all of the other lower limb muscles. This, again, is critical for rehab, because we can't compensate for problems in the neuromuscular function of the calf by rehabilitating your glutes or other muscles to try and compensate, because it has to do a huge role. If it doesn't, where does the stress go? The stress goes through connective tissue, which is the intramuscular tendons or the Achilles tendon. And as best we understand, this leads to an increase in the pliability of your Achilles, and is part of the mechanistic cause of getting Achilles tendinopathy. It's not just steady state running either. It's actually sprinting as well. So what we now have is coming out of blocks. The first step is the red, 7th step's green, and then we've got the 19th step as a track athlete comes off a block start. And what you'll see is the soleal forces are now 10 times body weight per step as we accelerate. This is hugely critical. Yes, we'll get a lot of proximal muscle activation as we sprint. We're not saying that doesn't happen, but the calf has to be working first and foremost. So really, we've got to make sure it rehabilitates back to normal. And what does normal look like? And is it just straight line running? No, it seems to correspond as well to change of direction. The calf strength, or your plantar flexor force, directly corresponds to your ability to change speed. There's also a little bit of a role for soleus with a posterior translation of your tibia, and its relevance to ACL injuries as well. It will pull the tibia backwards at about 30% of your capacity of your hamstrings, making it likely very important in a number of injuries. And we've got a large data set just wrapping up analysis around soleal strength post-ACL injury. So if we go for a run or we play football and we do 11 kilometers a game, which is your typical distance a midfielder will cover, the soleal forces for an average player weight of around about 80 kilos will be 2.6 million kilos of force. That's where you get fatigue. It's a huge amount. And you also need substantial recovery afterwards. And that recovery needs to be about optimizing repair through processes like nutrition, as well as appropriate training loads. So we really have to be aware of that. And what tends to happen in clubs when we work with them is they're super good at monitoring the 3 hours the athlete's in the club doing a training session. They get all the GPS data. What they forget about is the other 21 hours of the day. The athlete goes home to their family, they walk their dog, play with their children, they might go and play golf, and a lot of footballers will go golfing most days in the week. They end up with another 10,000, 20,000 steps on top of their training load. So you start to then understand why the next day's training causes a problem. It wasn't what you did with increasing the load, it was what they've been doing outside. So always make sure you look at the rest of the day during your rehabilitation as well. Now, we haven't published this data yet. It got kicked back from one of the journals, so it's just going back into another journal. It's 150 elite or professional soccer players, football players, looking at strength. And these plots show you what normal strength is on an isometric test that we'd sort of worked on for a number of years. So you can see that goalkeepers are weaker. And you can see that the other player metrics are of an appropriate level. This is what we've got to aim to achieve in order to return to play. And if you can get twice body weight on an isometric test, the internal muscle forces are around about 7 to 12 times body weight. That's the physiological loads I just showed you on the previous charts. So it actually matches that we'd anticipate it should produce a force of X. We've tested it, and it produces a force of X. We've published data extensively already in elite rugby on 300 plus players, showing a very similar sort of target for strength as well in those injuries. And we've previously presented that weakness in that muscle actually leads to a higher injury of calf and Achilles problems. It's not been published yet, it's about to go into review, but that data set has 120 calf or Achilles injuries in it. So we're pretty confident that it's powered appropriately. It's statistically bomb-proof at the moment. We've had everybody look at it that we can in the university. So hopefully that'll be out soon. Now, why would we bother about strength and neuromuscular function? Well, strength directly corresponds to your sprint speeds, 10-meter sprints or 30-meter sprints. This work's already published, okay, for the calf. So if we want to get player buy-in or coaches buy-in, we talk to them about performance improvements and robustness, not just rehabilitation from the given injury that they have at that phase. And what we might see during rehab, this is an elite rugby player for England Roses, so women's rugby. They've had an injury late last year during the Six Nations, and then you can see their strength on the left leg going up using an isometric test over repeat tests. Those tests are only about 4 weeks apart, and you can see they return to roughly their normal, which is approximately twice body weight for them. You won't always find an individual deficit between limbs, particularly if they have an Achilles problem as well, which is quite common to go hand in hand with Soleus issues. They'll often have a bilateral deficit when we compare them to the normative targets. So just be aware of that. Now, if you want to do some testing and you want to look at return to play, part of the kit we like to use is isokinetics, but actually a lot of people won't have access to one. And we were just discussing this with Carlos about injuries. You'll find that sometimes the isometric test is perfect. They can hit the target you want. It's a cheap and dirty test, okay? It doesn't give you all of the understanding about the neuromuscular function that you might want. So normally you can see the peak force when you do an isokinetic test is in a dorsiflexed position. That's really important because what a lot of us end up doing in rehab is we rehab from plantigrade, neutral, into plantarflex positions, or we do very heavy isometric exercises in this type of position. It's totally irrelevant to your function and where you normally produce force. When you get somebody with a calf or Achilles problem, they have a discoordinated pattern. They're not just weaker, it's a neuromuscular alteration in their firing pattern, and it's normally present on both limbs. So what you should have is peak force just there, just to remind you, and what you tend to get is charts like this. So the bottom two graphs are healthy people, and you can see there's a difference between limb. What you can see in the top graph, though, in the dorsiflex position from neutral right the way up to 20 degrees of dorsiflexion is this trough that is present on both legs. That's when they step back and go into this position, their muscle is not firing appropriately. Well, how do you injure your calf? If you watch slow-mo footage of calf injuries, it tends to be a step back, just like the Achilles tendon ruptures occur, and predominantly just like we'll see for a lot of the gastroc injuries, whether the Soleus or not. So that's the position we want to rehab in the dorsiflex positions where the injuries occur, where the weaknesses seem to exist when we look at large numbers of people. That's our particular focus, but it's the bit that gets missed in most of the clubs we end up working with. Actually, you can see on the other graph, you've got total discoordination on the eccentric phase. So sometimes peak force will be good, but it's the coordination we need to look at as well. When in the range they generate the force, and have they got the capacity to shock absorb and decelerate eccentrically in the phase where injuries occur. So just to show you just a whole variety of how that might look on graphs, it can be very small in the top left one as well. So we'll use a sort of target. They're our key performance indicators for return to play, these particular zones. So a variety of tests, and we can share the protocol with you if you're interested. We've previously published on it, but related it to Achilles tendon problems predominantly, because that's where our research sat at the time. So when we look at rehab, and we're trying to rehabilitate the gastroc, or the Soleus, but in this case the Soleus, we'll target 3 particular aspects of load. We'll do the peak load that goes through the tissue, and we'll use testing in the gym or in the lab to do that. We'll look at accumulative loads, so when they're running a given distance or walking a given distance, and then we'll also look at load rates. That's the speed the stress goes through that particular body part. And in this case, that might be one of these intramuscular tendons. So we'll do that all using a activity or modification model, previously called a pain monitoring model, but activity modification, I think, is Karen's preferred term nowadays around this. It makes far more sense to people, and this is what we try and do. But we also build in that other 21 of the hours of the day they're not with the club. We also are really bad as therapists normally of doing these lovely exercises in the gym that's perfectly straight. And then your player goes back out into their sport, and the position that they load in is totally different. We need to make sure we use these on-field or on-court dirty positions that replicate stress, that will go through different aspects of the tendon or the muscle in order to stress the injured site, because I guarantee the player will have a position that probably hurts them the most, and they've been avoiding it during the rehab because they think it's harmful to go into that position. We want to adapt that bit of tissue, so we want to stress them in that position, and that's really what we try and do. So our rehabilitation will be very similar to what we do for an Achilles tendinopathy or an Achilles tendon rupture, because really we're actually rehabilitating the same functional goals, typically, for the same muscle sort of performance alongside the tendon. And we'll use any of these aspects at different times of the rehab and may step back and go into other areas. We used to have the graphic as a pyramid, but it works much better when you think about rehabilitating and you can just add in different bits as you go. So that's our preferred way. But as Pete was talking about earlier, we have to think about the person we're managing. Because when we're dealing with these patients, they're typically, sort of with the elite athletes, there'll be 2 character types. They'll force through it and think more pain, more gain, or they'll avoid it because they think pain's harmful and damaging. It depends on the sport they're in and their culture. So they're bits we need to tease back, and we stop some people from exercising, as Carlos was talking about earlier, or we might have to force them into doing more because they actually need more stress and more load in order to get adaptations that we want. We've published this in the Barcelona book a little while back on tendon injuries, but it relates to calf muscle injuries. You target the loads in the bottom sort of first 2 phases, and then you move into rates of loading that will use on-field tasks, cutting tasks, plyometrics, accelerations, decelerations, all of these bits built in. And then as you get into the next step, the sport-specific drills, you add in time challenges. You make it a cognitive challenging task. A defender comes at you or an attacker comes at you and you have to react to the on-field situation. That's when you can't concentrate on how you're moving your own body and is a key part for return to play and readiness. And in the very last phase, we ideally want them full training for probably 3 weeks, which never happens in elite sport. You can't get that. They're straight back in. But ideally, we want them full training, but they need to be totally subconsciously able to do everything that they need to do in their playing position. That's the core requirement there. So, common mistakes, and then we're wrapped up. So most people, when they do rehab for calf injuries per se, and the same applies to Achilles, it's insufficient maximal voluntary contraction. You need to know what they can actually do first and test it and then work towards it. You need to avoid just rehabbing in these positions that are not relevant to where you generate force out on field. So it's dorsiflex positions and you go into extreme ranges because the athlete will hit that when they're training. You focus on eccentric decelerations because, again, that's key part of the injury mechanism. And we make sure the positions that you're exercising in are complex and replicate the positions that may hurt them or they will go into on field. The take-homes for you from today really are know which tissue we're talking about. How we'd rehab a Soleus injury in relation to the different grades will be different currently. We might change our mind as we get more data, but based on what we know, we're a little bit more cautious, probably because we're too fearful rather than maybe the actual patient. But that's where we stand at the moment with the current evidence. Respect some of the healing times, don't just force through it. And also, like Carlos was mentioning, look at what happens to the muscle. We commonly find big problems where when they contract, the actual injury site opens up instead of moving or doing anything else. It splits open. They're really problematic and they will go into a boot and have something stuck in there to try and stick it back together. Work eccentrically. It gets a bad press. Eccentrics are critical for human performance. You've got to rehabilitate eccentric function properly, but make sure you consider the person you're dealing with at all time points. Thank you very much.